That ain't hunger, that's famine. You better check twice, he's pretty dirty.
The Wild West was a time of rugged cowboys, fearless pioneers, and saloon showdown.
The Wild West conjures images of gunfights, outlaws, and debauchery. But how much of this is true?
It's the era of manifest destiny, gold rushes, and endless adventure.
Oh no, I've got a serious problem. Oh my goodness. We had nuts everywhere. Just everywhere.
Or so Hollywood made it look like. But in reality, life on the frontier America wasn't just tough, it was downright disgusting. From gross hygiene habits to foods that would make your stomach churn, it was a world where surviving often meant putting up with the grossest of conditions. Come with me and get ready to explore the disgusting side of life in the Wild West. Number 1, non-existent bathing routine. All right, let's start with the basics. Bathing, or should I just say the lack of it? Bathing in the Wild West was more of a rare event than a regular routine. With water being scarce, especially in barren regions, many settlers and cowboys went weeks and sometimes months without even a rinse.
The majority of royal females smelt fairly awful by today's standards, since they lacked basic personal hygiene.
And when they did bathe, it was usually in a shared tub. Families or groups of settlers would take turns in the same water, starting with the cleanest person, which was often the father or the mother, and working their way down to the dirtiest. By the end, the water would turn more mud than a bath. And to top it off, doing all this with soap that was harsh, homemade, and smelled almost as bad as you did. People didn't even bother washing their hair often. Instead, they'd coat it with animal fat to keep it moisturized. As a result, they had scalps crawling with lice. Cleanliness might have been next to godliness, but in the Wild West, it was practically a miracle.
After a royal party had settled at a palace, a stench would quickly develop due to improperly disposed of food, animal waste, vermin from or drawn to unclean bodies, and human excrement.
Number 2, the dental nightmare. Next up is dental care. Frontier dental care was, well, barely a thing. Toothbrushes existed, but they were made with coarse boar bristles that could damage your gums as much as clean them, and toothpaste was usually a mix of ashes, salt, and sometimes chalk. It's no surprise that most people ended up with rotten, blackened, or missing teeth. And just in case you had a toothache, the solution was simple. Pull it out. No anesthetic and no numbing gels, just pliers, brute strength, and a gulp of whiskey for courage.
There existed a time when even the bravest souls quivered in fear at the thought of a visit to the local dentist.
If you were lucky, the local blacksmith or barber might do the honors. And if you weren't, anyone with a strong grip could take a crack at it. For those who could afford dentures, things weren't better for them either. They were often made from wood, ivory, or even the teeth of dead animals. Some people even wore dentures crafted from the teeth of deceased humans. Now, that's a horrible smile.
Their tools seemed like they were straight out of the Spanish Inquisition. Pliers for yanking teeth, or contraptions resembling bottle openers.
Number 3, a food group of bug. Frontier cuisine wasn't for the faint of heart or stomach. Preserving food was tricky. Without modern refrigeration, supplies like flour, sugar, and cornmeal were stored in wooden barrels or cloth sacks, which were anything but airtight.
Life on the trail wasn't easy, but without the chuck wagon, it would never have been possible.
Bugs like weevils, ants, and even maggots would find their way in and make themselves at home. Instead of throwing the food away, settlers would sieve out the larger critters and use the rest. But let's be real, no sifting method was perfect. Pioneers joked that if you didn't see bugs in your bread, you just weren't looking hard enough. Even dried meat wasn't safe. Flies would lay eggs in it, turning your snack into a protein-packed nightmare. And speaking of protein, grasshoppers and locusts sometimes made it onto the menu out of necessity. After all, if the crops were destroyed, why not eat the destroyers? Yum.
Such large amounts of salt was needed to preserve certain foods that it hardened the texture of the meats and reduced some of the nutritional value.
Number 4, streets were literal cesspool. Main streets were the bustling heart of every Wild West town. You might think it would look like wooden sidewalks and swinging saloon doors, but let's talk about what those ideal Hollywood sets leave out. Horse manure.
Horses, oxen, mules, moving wagons, and people on dirt streets. How did they keep it all clean?
Horses were the primary mode of transportation, which meant the streets were constantly littered with their dropping. And in addition to that, the occasional cow, pig, or stray dog. And you've got yourself a recipe for a stinky, mushy mess. Towns tried to combat the problem by hiring scavengers who scooped the dung all day. But let's face it, they couldn't keep up. Rain only made things worse, turning the streets into ankle-deep sludge that mixed mud with manure. And if you slipped and fell, well, good luck getting that smell out of your clothes or your dignity.
Each town had its own way of cleaning the streets. Citizens were asked to take their trash to a dedicated dump site instead of using the alleys and streets.
Number 5. Chamber pots hazard. In the absence of indoor plumbing, chamber pots were the go-to toilet for most families. They were used in 2 simple steps. 1. Do your business. 2. Dump it outside. But this system came with some risks.
In early America, chamber pots and funny-looking bedpans were common in most homes for folks to do their business in.
Imagine walking down the street, minding your own business, and suddenly getting drenched with, you know it. I don't know about you. I would just run away from a life like this. And if you think outhouses were any better, think again. They were often poorly constructed, prone to collapsing, and rarely emptied. In the summer, the foul smell was unbearable, and in winter, freezing temperatures turned them into icy torture chambers. Worst of all, some unlucky people would just fall into cesspits, a literal nightmare.
These structures had to be made simple and somewhat light so that they could be moved to a different location when the pits filled up to half a meter from the top of the ground.
Number 6. Inevitable epidemic. Life in the Wild West wasn't just gross, it was extremely deadly. Diseases like cholera, dysentery, smallpox, and tuberculosis.
I'm going to spare you the horrid symptoms of some of these diseases that plagued our forefathers in the era of westward expansion.
Spread like wildfire through towns and settlement. With poor sanitation, contaminated water, and little medical knowledge, entire communities could be wiped out in weeks. For example, let's talk about cholera. It was often caused by drinking water contaminated with human waste, something that was pretty hard to avoid when you lived downstream from another town. The symptoms were brutal: vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration, so severe that people died within hours. Smallpox was another major killer. Vaccines existed but were hard to come by, and infected people were sometimes quarantined in pest houses, which were little more than death traps. If you survived, you were left with scars as a gross reminder of the trauma.
Have been used to determine the likely cause of this mysterious epidemic that contributed to a cataclysmic population decline.
Number 7. Bedbugs, lice, and other creepy crawlers. If you think your last motel stay was bad, try sleeping in a Wild West bed. Mattresses were often stuffed with straw, horsehair, or wool, and all of this would make perfect hiding spots for bedbugs, fleas, and lice.
You're in the deepest sleep you'll be in all night, and the bedbugs are ready to strike.
Lice weren't just a problem, they were a constant companion. People would scratch themselves so much they'd develop sores, which sometimes got infected, and bedbugs would feast on you all night long, leaving itchy red welts as souvenirs. There was no pest control back then, so people just lived with the infestation, occasionally burning their mattresses when it got too unbearable. Talk about a hot mess. Number 8. Dirty water, dirty living. Water is life, but in the Wild West, it could also be death. Clean water was hard to find, and settlers often relied on rivers, streams, or wells.
Folks who made a living on the back of a member of the equine family would normally have to carry water.
And the major problem was that these water sources were easily contaminated by animal waste, sewage, or dead bodies upstream. Cholera outbreaks were common, and so were other waterborne illnesses like typhoid and dysentery. And filtering water was not really a thing back then. Some people boiled it, but many didn't bother at all. After all, it's not like they could see the bacteria swimming around. So every sip was a gamble. Cheers. Number 9. The cow chips fuel. In the Wild West, wood was literally a hot commodity. But in the treeless plains, settlers had to get creative with their fuel source, so they would make use of cow chip. And no, we're not talking about some rustic snack.
Surface of grounds in front of the sun so that it will dry properly.
Cow chips were dried chunks of cow dung, which pioneers collected and burned to cook meals and heat their homes. Believe it or not, they were surprisingly efficient as fuel. But here's the thing, they smelled like cow dung. Imagine sitting down to a meal cooked over a steaming pile of burning poop. Bon appetit, cowboy. Number 10. Tragic wagon breakdown. For settlers traveling west, wagons were their lifeline, packed with everything they owned. But these wooden wagons were far from reliable. Wheels broke, axles snapped, and the rough terrain turned every journey into a mechanical nightmare.
Traveling along the Oregon Trail was actually more complicated than it sounds. From the different types of wagons used to the animals needed to pull them, a lot of different factors went into traveling west.
Repairing a wagon in the middle of nowhere wasn't easy, especially without the right tools or spare parts. A broken wagon meant delays, leaving families stranded and vulnerable to the elements, predators, or even hostile encounters. Some travelers had to abandon their wagons altogether, leaving behind cherished possessions to continue the journey on foot.
Between 1840 and 1860, roughly 400,000 people traveled the 2,000-mile path of the Oregon Trail, encountering sickness, death, exhaustion, and other hardships.
Number 11, hygiene. During the gold rush. During the gold rush, miners flocked to California in search of fortune, but hygiene wasn't high on their priority list. Living in crowded camps with little access to clean water or soap, prospectors became walking, talking Petri dishes.
It was estimated that 2 billion worth of precious metals were unearthed during its entirety.
Their diets, which consisted mainly of beans, bacon, and whiskey, didn't help. Scurvy, which is a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was out of control. Symptoms included bleeding gums, rotting teeth, and open sores. And as if this wasn't enough, the stink of unwashed bodies and the constant presence of worms and bugs made it even more disgusting. I mean, I feel like we are just talking about one of the least glamorous chapters in history.
When men were men, and where saloons were thick with the smell of whiskey and tobacco, as bar brawls broke out over women.
Number 12, gross saloon floors. Saloons might seem like the heart of Wild West nightlife, but they were far from classy and entertaining. Their floors were often covered in a disgusting mix of spilt drinks, chewed up tobacco, and sawdust. The sawdust was to soak up all the spit, vomit, and blood from bar fights.
Not only did saloons eventually close for the night, but in cold or wet weather it would be prudent to have something that keeps out the elements.
And let's not forget the odor of stale alcohol, sweat, and unwashed bodies mingling with the sweet aroma of cigar smoke. And if you passed out on the floor after one too many drinks, you'd wake up smelling like everything that had spilt there. I think I would just not like to go to a saloon for the rest of my life.
Wild West saloons represented the very ideals of the American West. From small camps to established towns, they were a fixture of settlements across the frontier.
Number 13, traumatizing doctor visits. One of the most traumatizing experiences of that time would be visiting a Wild West doctor. Medical knowledge was limited, and many doctors weren't formally trained.
At first, there were no formally educated doctors in the valley. Your spouse and your neighbor were the only hope you had if you got injured.
Surgeries were often performed without anesthesia, and tools weren't sterilized because germ theory wasn't widely accepted yet. For pain relief, doctors might give you alcohol, opium, or nothing at all. If you needed a limb amputated, you'd better hope the doctor was fast, because infection would often set in before the stump healed. And don't even ask about childbirth. It's truly a miracle anyone survived a trip to the doctor in those days.
You had 3 healthcare options. 1, find a doctor. 2, figure out how to cure your own ailment. Or 3, die.
Number 14, the stuff of nightmare. Outhouses, or privies, were already gross enough, but if you think they were just for doing your business, think again. Spiders, snakes, and even rats were known to make their homes in these dark, smelly pits.
Most people in the Wild West lived in squalor. The environment they lived in was harsh, dirty, and dangerous.
It wasn't uncommon for someone to sit down and get bitten by a venomous critter lying below. And let's not forget the occasional prankster who'd suddenly tip over an occupied outhouse for laughs. Honestly, just holding it in seems like the better option.
See that white towel hanging from the bar? Many cowboys used it to wipe alcohol from their beards, and it was never replaced.
Number 15, saloon glassware. Ordering a drink in a Wild West saloon wasn't just a gamble for your sobriety. It was a gamble for your health as well. Bartenders rarely washed their glass. Instead, they'd give them a quick rinse in a basin of dirty water that was used for every customer. Sometimes they didn't bother rinsing at all. If you saw lipstick, or worse on your glass, you just drank from the other side and hoped for the best. And considering the general lack of hygiene, it's safe to say those glasses were teeming with bacteria, bottoms up.
Batwing partitions, sawdust floors, and rows of dusty bottles adorning illuminated shelves are often the first things that come to mind when we think of iconic saloons from the Old West.
Number 16, DIY tattoos gone bad. Tattoos may seem like a modern trend, but people in the Wild West were already getting ink, not exactly with sanitized tools or professional artists.
Soldiers from both sides of the Civil War were getting tattoos, probably as a rite of passage or to commemorate a particular battle.
Frontier tattoos were often done out of necessity, serving as identifiers, tribal symbols, or a way to memorialize a loved one. However, the methods were painfully crude. Settlers would use sharp objects like needles, knives, or even nails to pierce the skin. For ink, they got creative by mixing soot from campfire ashes, coal dust, or berry juice into a paste. But the results were less art and more ouch. Without any sterilization, these DIY tattoos were a prime source of infection. The skin would swell and scar so badly that the original design became unrecognizable. Number 17, haircuts were rare and gross. Sure, barbershops were a thing in the Wild West, but they weren't exactly accessible to everyone. For many settlers and cowboys, a trip to the barber was a luxury they either couldn't afford or didn't prioritize.
Barbers early in history also would provide medical services. Their ability to wield sharp instruments meant that some surgeries and bloodletting was in their wheelhouse.
Instead, haircuts happened rarely, often only when the hair became too long to manage or unbearably infested with lice. Hair washing wasn't a regular activity either, since water was scarce and soap was a prized possession. Over time, unwashed hair would accumulate oils, dirt, and sometimes even lice eggs. To make matters worse, when people did finally cut their hair, it was often done with dull scissors or knives, which left jagged ends and an uneven look. For women, long hair was seen as a sign of beauty, but managing it in such filthy conditions must have been a nightmare. So, whether you were a cowboy or a saloon girl, your scalp was likely a haven for all kinds of filthy bugs. Number 18, frequently spoiled food. Eating in the Wild West wasn't just about filling your belly. It was more like taking a bet on your health. Without refrigeration, settlers relied on preservation methods like salting, smoking, or drying. While these methods helped, they didn't guarantee freshness.
Even after some simple research, it became clear that food at the time was more complicated, interesting, and flavorful than anyone could easily assume.
Meat often went sour, giving it a slimy texture and a smell that could make even the most hardened cowboy gag. For settlers who relied on grains, the problem wasn't much better. Flour and cornmeal were often infested with weevils or other insects. If you were lucky, you'd catch them before cooking. If not, your bread came with a little extra protein. Dairy products, if available, turned sour quickly in the heat. Eggs might have been a rare treat, but there was always a chance of cracking one open and finding it had gone bad or partially developed into a chick. When fresh produce wasn't available, scurvy and malnutrition became common. Food might have kept you alive, but it didn't always do so without a fight. Number 19, surprises in the alcohol. Saloons were the go-to spot for a stiff drink, but the alcohol served there often came with some extra ingredient. Bottled whiskey and rum were hard to come by, so saloon owners often made their own concoction, which were less about quality and more about getting the job done cheaply.
Many saloon keepers would flavor that with tobacco juice, burnt sugar, chili peppers, and even snake heads.
Drinks were often mixed with water to increase the supply, but some went further. Bartenders might add things like tobacco juice, turpentine, or even kerosene to give the liquor a kick. In some cases, the alcohol was outright toxic, containing wood alcohol that could cause blindness or death. Even legitimate drinks weren't safe, as glasses were rarely washed properly. You might find remnants of someone else's chew tobacco, or the lingering taste of last night's whiskey in your cup. Number 20, the shoe torture. Footwear in the Wild West was a nightmare of both form and function. Shoes and boots were handmade, and good ones were expensive. Most people couldn't afford custom fitting, so they made do with ill-fitting, uncomfortable options. Shoes were rarely replaced, even when they were falling apart. Instead, settlers would patch them up as best they could, using scraps of leather or cloth.
You may also see an extension in the back of the heel to support spurs. This is called a spur ridge.
When shoes finally became unwearable, some people went barefoot. It was again a risky move in the frontier, where sharp rocks, thorns, and snake bites were common hazards. For those who stuck with their boots, wet conditions were another issue. Once soaked, boots could take days to dry out, often growing mold or developing a smell that no one wanted to deal with. And when the soles worn through, it wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a place for infection, especially in a world without proper medical care. Number 21, rats in the rafters. Wherever humans go, rats are sure to follow, and the Wild West was no exception. The homes, barns, and food storage areas of the settlers were magnets for these furry invaders.
It was insane.
It's clear the rats have found an abundant food supply nearby.
Grain supplies were particularly vulnerable, as rats would chew through sacks and leave droppings behind, contaminating whatever was left. Rats weren't just an issue, they were a serious health risk. They carried fleas that spread diseases like typhus and the bubonic plague. Settlers often woke up to find evidence of rats in their home, from gnawed furniture to bite marks on their hands or faces. Traps and poisons were used, but they were only partially effective. Cats were a common solution, but even they couldn't keep the rat population in check. Rats were simply an unavoidable part of life in the Wild West, and the sounds of scurrying in the night became a haunting lullaby for many settlers. Number 22, makeup gone bad. Looking good in the Wild West came with a heavy price, and that price would sometimes be your health. Makeup of the era was made with ingredients that were as harmful as they were effective. Face powders often contained lead or arsenic.
A round ball of soap will be rubbed onto a sponge, and then the sponge will be used to clean the face and parts of the body.
both of which absorbed into the skin and caused chronic poisoning over time. Symptoms of lead poisoning included pale skin, which was ironically considered beautiful at the time. Other symptoms included hair loss and even organ failure. Arsenic, on the other hand, causes skin discoloration, sores, and eventually death if used regularly. Lipsticks and blushes weren't much better either, because they were often made from crushed insects or mercury. While these products provided the desired pop of color, they also exposed women to toxic substances. In a world already filled with danger, beauty practices were another unexpected threat. Number 23. Public execution. Life in the Wild West was harsh, and so was its justice system. Public executions were a common punishment for crimes like horse theft or murder, and they often became horrible community events. Families, including children, would gather to watch hanging, treating them as grim entertainment.
Step back in time to the Wild West, where the balance of law and order was as fragile as a spider's web.
However, executions didn't always go smoothly. Inexperienced hangmen sometimes used the wrong length of rope, resulting in decapitations or prolonged strangulation instead of a quick neck snap. Either way, it was a hideous spectacle. After the execution, the bodies were often left hanging as a warning to others, which meant they started decomposing in full view of the public. The smell, combined with the visual horror, made these events truly disgusting. Yet, for many, they were just another part of life in the Wild West. Number 24. Filthy mining camp. The gold and silver rush brought thousands of prospectors to the Wild West, but mining camps were far from glamorous. These emergency settlements were overcrowded, poorly planned, and full of filth. Trash piled up quickly, and human waste was often disposed of in nearby ditches or streams, contaminating water supply. Drinking from these sources led to outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne illness. The camps themselves were also hotbeds of disease. Miners, packed into tight quarters, rarely bathed or changed clothes, leading to lice infestations and skin disease. The air was filled with the smell of unwashed body, rotting food, and sometimes even the chemicals used in mining. While the promise of riches brought people to these camps, the conditions often sent them to an early grave. Number 25. Frequent skin infection. In an era without antibiotics or antiseptics, even the smallest cut or scrape could initiate big trouble. Settlers and cowboys were constantly at risk of skin infection, especially since they worked with sharp tools, handled animals, and lived in environments filled with dirt and bacteria.
Access to clean water was limited, and soap was expensive, often leading people to bathe only once a month or less.
Simple wounds often became infected, turning into painful boils or abscess. If untreated, these infections could lead to sepsis or gangrene, necessitating amputation. But not to forget, even amputations were done without sterilized tools or proper pain relief, so they often caused more problems than they solved. Rashes and fungal infections were also common, thanks to sweat, poor hygiene, and a lack of clean clothing. In the Wild West, keeping your skin healthy was nearly impossible, and the consequences were often disgusting and deadly. Number 26. Animals in the home. On the frontier, practicality often topped cleanliness. Livestock and pets were sometimes brought indoors, especially during harsh weather, or to protect them from predators. While this made sense, it also turned homes into glorified barns. Chickens roamed freely, leaving a mess on the floors. Pigs that were prized for their meat were sometimes kept inside for weeks at a time, filling homes with their terrible smell. Even cows and goats occasionally made appearances indoors, especially if they were sick or about to give birth. The presence of animals also meant an increase in flies, fleas, and ticks, which quickly found their way onto humans. While these practices helped settlers survive, they turned homes into filthy, smelly places that were far from the cozy frontier cabins we see in movies. Number 27. Stagecoach suffering. Traveling by stagecoach may look like a romantic adventure in Western film, but the reality was far from glamorous. Stagecoaches were essentially wooden boxes on wheels with minimal suspension, jolting passengers over every rock and rut on the rugged roads. Inside, there was little room to stretch out. Up to 9 passengers crammed into a space meant for 6, and personal space wasn't even a concept. For days on end, travelers endured the boiling heat of summer or the bone-chilling cold of winter, often with windows that couldn't be opened or closed properly. Stops were few and far between, and comfort breaks involved stepping into the wilderness to take care of business. That too sometimes, while the coach barely pawed. The roads themselves were a nightmare, with dangers like washed-out paths, bandits, or runaway horses. As if that wasn't enough, the smell inside was unbearable. Because of unwashed bodies squeezed together, mixed with the odor of sweat-soaked leather and horse manure wafting through the air. Yet, For many, it was the only way to travel. Forget luxury. This was survival on wheels. Number 28. Makeshift coffin. In the untamed Wild West, death was a frequent visitor, but proper burials were a luxury few could afford. Coffins were expensive and often unavailable in remote settlement. Instead, settlers got creative, crafting makeshift coffins from whatever materials were on hand. Old wooden crates, wagon boards, or even broken doors were repurposed to house the deceased. In some cases, when wood was scarce, bodies were simply wrapped in blankets or tarps and buried directly in the ground. Time was often of the essence, especially in summer, when the heat made decomposition an important concern. Graves were shallow and markers were basic, sometimes just a pile of stones or a wooden cross hammered together on the spot. These quick burials left the graves vulnerable to scavenging animals or erosion, often erasing any trace of the departed. The realities of frontier life meant the dead were often laid to rest as simply and hastily as possible, reflecting the harshness and impermanence of life in the West. Life in the Wild West was as hard as it gets, literally. While it's fun to romanticize the era as a time of cowboy heroics and untamed freedom, the reality was a lot messier and much more disgusting. If you think your modern problems are bad, just remember, at least you don't have to cook over burning cow dung. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time for more weird and wild history.